Last week we talked about the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. Do you remember? Surpassing worth of knowing Christ. And for Paul, he was so captivated by this worth that he considered everything else in his life as garbage. And surprisingly, in the original Greek, when he said, I consider everything as garbage, in the original Greek it's actually poop. I consider everything else poop. But what's truly surprising is that he was referring to not really bad things in his life, but actually really good things, such as his family line, religious titles, and academic accomplishments. Yet good is actually bad when compared to the best. And Paul wanted to have the best in his life. It's like you're in the parents' car, in the back seat, and you're hungry, and you start eating French fries. And French fries and Coke or chicken nuggets are actually pretty good when you're hungry, right? But suddenly, they become garbage when your parents tell you that we are actually driving to Michelin-rated restaurant. And you have tons of chicken nuggets, Coke, and French fries in your mouth. They're actually good. But as soon as you hear that, what do you do in your mouth? You treat it as garbage. You're probably not going to swallow, but throw it away. Why? Because you want to fill yourself with the best thing possible in you. So last week we learned that Christ is the most valuable thing in our lives, and everything else, even the good things, is garbage by comparison. But here, the more important question is this: how do we actually have the surpassing worth of Christ? How do we actually have it? It is one thing to know that the diamond is expensive. It's the most expensive gem, right? It's one thing to know. And it's quite another to actually have it, right? Big difference between knowing that diamond is expensive and to actually have it. Last week we looked at the knowing Christ is like the diamond. It's expensive. And today's sermon is about how we actually have it. So that's the question we're going to tackle today. In today's passage, Paul starts by saying, I want to know Christ. I want to know Christ. So he means, I want to have more of Christ. I want to have more and more of Christ, the best thing in my life. And he tells us how to have Christ. We see that it's by to know the power of his resurrection and to participate in his sufferings. That's how he can have the surpassing worth of Christ. So clearly, to have Christ is to know Christ. And to know Christ is to have Christ. But knowing Christ isn't just about learning tons of biblical knowledge, knowing all the facts about Jesus and all the facts about the Bible. That's not what it is. Although these things can really help. But it's the true knowing is actually participating in his life and uniting with him. That's the knowledge that Paul is talking about. And there's a specific term for this. It's union with Christ. Have you ever heard of the term union with Christ? It's actually one of the most important themes in the Bible, union with Christ. And can you think of an image that represents the union with Christ? Jesus actually said it in John 15, union with Christ. What is it? If you guys did QT, you probably should remember. It's a vine and the branch, right? They're united, union with Christ. So though union with Christ can be like kind of abstract and vague in your head, it's actually quite straightforward because we know it pretty well from our personal experiences. For example, how do you really know someone? How do you really know someone? You wouldn't say it's through social media, right? Would you say, oh, I know someone really well through social media? You wouldn't say that, right? Or a resume. After reading resume, would you say, oh yeah, I know this person? Or job interviews. Can you know someone really deeply through job interviews? Some of the members are smiling and laughing because you know through the job interviews you cannot know truly about a person. But how do you know a person very, very deeply? It's by listening to their stories, their joys and sorrows, and really walking through the every moment of their lives. And that's how we form a deep relationship and truly have them in our lives. Christina once told me how I won her over in college. She said she liked me because I listened to her joys and sorrows, and I really try to participate in every moment of our life. And I never said, let me know if you need any help, right? We like to say that, let me know if you need any help. I never said that because I was already there. And I listened to her happy and sad moments. And by uniting with her every moment, more and more, as I unite more and more and get to know more, she became more and more of mine. And finally, she became mine. In a similar way, we gain surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ by uniting with Him and by participating in every aspect of His life. And Paul says in verse 11 that when we participate in Jesus' life, that is in every aspect, right? Suffering, death, and resurrection, what do we receive? What do we receive? It says we receive the glorious resurrection from the dead. The fact that Jesus can give us resurrection, He surpasses anyone in our lives, like our parents, our spouse, our children. They don't surpass Jesus because they cannot give us resurrection, because they too will die. And money cannot resurrect a person, but Jesus can resurrect you. And that's why knowing Jesus has a surpassing worth. And you might wonder why uniting with Christ is so crucial to receive resurrection. And let me illustrate this that shows how union with Christ results in your resurrection. Can you make a connection between how uniting with Christ results in your resurrection? Listen to this illustration. So over the past 5 years, I've gone through probably the hardest time in my life. It was a lot harder than working in the company, which is known for its strenuous work environment. But last year's was, I would say, harder because I had to juggle between the PhD program as a full-time student and pastoral ministry. I had to juggle, and also, managing household and homeschooling and everything. It was very hard. And PhD studies was actually really hard. Sometimes for like 3 months, I wouldn't be able to write even a single word because I was just stuck. It felt like I was being stuck in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on a sailboat with no wind. So I was in a state of doldrums. And I would be stuck there for like 3-4 months. And I was watching a movie about a girl, Australian girl, and she was 16 and she made a record of sailing the whole around the world by herself in a sailing boat. And there was a moment she was in the Atlantic Ocean and there was no wind, and for 2 weeks she couldn't move, and she was so depressed and she wanted to quit and she cried. And when I was watching that, I was like, oh, that's me. And I remember crying that scene because I so resonated with that. But other times, more recently, I felt like the wind was blowing, and the wind really pushed me toward finishing my dissertation. And by the grace of God, I am close to completing my PhD studies, and I really hope to graduate next year, May. And that day, next year, May, I imagine that day would be like this. Glorious, sunny, and the day would be almost like a little resurrection from the dead. PhD, D standing for death. Hopefully many people from our church will be able to participate and celebrate with me. And when I graduate, do you know who I will honor first? It will be my wife, Christina. On that day, I will hug her and I will hand over my graduation hat and put it on her head, and I will say this. I thought about what I would say. I would say this: Christina, you did it. You did it. Now, why do I do that? Why do I give my head to her and say that you did it? Why? Because she participated in my painful journey, and she shared in my suffering and also joys. She wept with me when I was weeping, and she celebrated with me when I was making progress. And she united with me from start to finish. So the glory of graduation is also hers, even though she didn't write a single word in my dissertation. In the same way, when we participate in Jesus' life, that is his suffering, his death, and his resurrection, he shares his glorious resurrection with us. He crowns us with the victorious crown on our head, even though we have not earned it. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ. But some people might think that resurrection is not a big deal, and it's not really worth uniting with Christ for. And let me share a story again, because I know you guys like stories a lot. So let me share a story, just how ultimate resurrection is, and why we desperately need resurrection. And that will explain why we need to unite with Christ. So, when I was about 10, I was in Korea. I didn't know speak any English. And there was a lady, it was in Seoul. There was a lady at our church, and she was the senior pastor's wife. Her name is Kim Bonghwa. And she was admired by everyone. She was so elegant in her style and her demeanor, her appearance, the way she talks and deals with people, and how she cares. She even cared for me when I was 10 years old, and I still feel her really gentle voice and gentle smile. And everyone, especially the ladies at the church, really wanted to become like her, including my mother. Fast forward 30 years, and this week I saw a recent photo of her on my Facebook. It was shared by someone else. So 30 years passed, and I was shocked that her beauty faded completely. I could hardly believe it was the same person. There was no trace of her former elegance or glory. She looked as good as dead. I would believe if that picture was picture of her death. So I showed this old and new photos of Bonghwa Kim to Christina and our children, and they were just as stunned. Especially Christina, because Bonghwa came to attend our wedding 16 years ago, looking stunningly elegant. But now, none of that remains with her. But she still has a game changer. What is it? The resurrection, the hope of resurrection. She has that. Because she united with Christ in Jesus' suffering and in his resurrection throughout her life. She knows that one day Jesus will raise her in a body even more radiant than when she was in her prime. And she knows that Jesus will crown her, saying, "My resurrection is yours because you always have been with me and you participated in my suffering, in my resurrection, in my death. You've been with me, so my resurrection, I give it to you." Just as I shared, I will be sharing my glory, my graduation with Christina, who participated in my life. Then we need to talk about the people on the other side. On the other hand, who won't be raised with Jesus? Who won't be raised with Jesus? Those who only show up for the good times but never unite with him in suffering. They are the people who will not be raised with Christ. It's like a co-worker or boss who takes the credit for your work or your project without having contributed to your hard work. Frustrating, right? Some of you have that experience. It's frustrating when they only try to take the glory. Or think about if you're students. Think about a classmate who skips all the group project work but wants to be on the final presentation. Frustrating, right? Jesus also said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I command? I never knew you. Who are you?" Sadly, many modern believers do the same. We enjoy upbeat worship, fellowship events, and community. But when it's time to serve behind the scenes, or comfort the hurting, or stand for what's right, many of us are absent. We pick the good parts of following Jesus, but avoid the sacrifice and obedience that the true discipleship requires. If we only show up for the celebration but never join in the hard work of building the body of Jesus Christ, then Christ cannot give you resurrection. Just as I cannot give my graduation hat to someone I barely know. Like, even though I want to give, it would be too awkward for me to give. Right? And the person will know that the person doesn't deserve it because there was no participation or unity, uniting with me or walking together with me. So, uniting with Christ in every moment, guys, is actually hard. It's hard. Don't think it's easy. Ask yourself, have you really united with Christ in his suffering, in his death and resurrection? Only few people will find it. Only few people will find it. And most people will think that they are saved, but really not united with Christ. So Jesus called it as a very narrow path. Very narrow path. And that's why Paul said, we must work out our salvation in fear and trembling. Why? Because most people will choose wide path, thinking that they are walking on the path of salvation. It's a dangerous path. And that's why we need to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Now, if you're taking this seriously, you might be asking, okay, Pastor, how do I actually participate in Jesus' life and unite with him? How do I actually do that? Okay, I get the point. How do I actually do that? In today's passage, Paul gives us two ways. First, know the power of his resurrection. Know the power of his resurrection. And second is to participate in his suffering, becoming like him in his death. So let's look at the first one. knowing the power of his resurrection. Knowing the power of his resurrection. If I have to choose the most powerful moment of human history, it would be the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because we know that dead people don't rise, right? And it was the power of God that was laser focused 2,000 years ago and raised the dead Jesus into life, right? So that is the most powerful moment where God's power came to that person and made him rise. And those who witnessed the risen Jesus, they were willing to die for Jesus. And people rarely die for something they don't actually believe in. In the end, they would deny at the end of their death, right? But people died for Jesus because dead people don't rise. And they saw something powerful, miraculous. So they had to say it. Yes, I saw Jesus who was dead and now living. And because there are so many people like that, the Roman Empire that once persecuted Christians, they ended up accepting Christianity as the official religion. Because there are so many people who are willing to die saying that Jesus has risen. So that was the power of resurrection of Jesus Christ. And now, fast forward 2,000 years, now, what does it mean for us to know the power of Christ and live our lives with the power of Christ? What does that mean? Anybody? What does it mean to live with the power of resurrection in our lives? What does that mean? That same power that raised Jesus from the dead is still working among us right now. For instance, let me tell you about how I understand this. For instance, I am not afraid of anything. I have no anxiety because I believe in resurrection. And because I believe in resurrection, I do not fear death. And death, as we know, is the scariest thing that we have. Nobody can escape, and we are scared of death. But because the Jesus died and rose again, I am not afraid of death. And if I am not afraid of death, what else is there to be afraid of? Nothing. Nothing. So the power of the resurrection rescues me from my worry, fear, and anxiety. I no longer live in fear. I used to. I was afraid of people. I wanted to be liked by people. And when I wasn't liked by people, when I wasn't recognized by people, I feared that. Some of you deeply fear that you might not be loved and recognized by other people. I no longer have that fear, but I am now driven by love. That is the power of resurrection. Because I don't fear death, I don't fear anything in my life. And another thing is this. If Jesus rose from the dead, and then that makes him the Son of God, because dead people don't rise, and everything he said in his life is valid. Think about the great command that Jesus has given to all of us. What is the great command? To love God with all your heart and to love your neighbors as yourself. And if Jesus really rose from the dead, then what he said becomes the guiding principle of my life. How can I possibly, if Jesus has really risen and gave the command, how can I possibly hate my brothers and sisters? How can I? Because Jesus is watching. He's the risen Lord, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and I worship him, and he's watching me. Minwoo, are you loving your brothers and sisters, and including your enemies? Do you love them? Lord, you are powerfully risen from the dead, and you are the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Yes, Lord, I will submit myself to you, and I love my enemies. I will love those who persecute me. So that is the power of resurrection works in me, powerfully shaping my heart and changing my heart? Do you have that resurrection power really working in your hearts and really shaping your lives? Do you feel that power of resurrection working within you? If you have that, you are uniting with Christ. You are uniting with Christ. Second, Paul says that we must participate in Jesus' suffering. And it's almost becoming like him in his death. And this is participating in his death is as crucial as knowing his resurrection power. We know that Jesus, in his life, he faced many rejections and misunderstandings. And when we stand for truth and righteousness in our school and our work, we may face similar challenges. But we should not avoid, but we must respond to those people with love and mercy, just as Jesus did. And Jesus also lived a life of self-denial, setting aside his comfort to serve other people. And similarly, we should follow his example of putting other people's needs first. So for example, Eugene has a lot of work, serving a lot of, a church, and she's filming, and we've been announcing many, many times, who's gonna put her needs before yours? Things like that. That's a practical example. And Jesus also felt a deep sorrow. He was weeping over the brokenness of the people around him. So we also can participate in his suffering by really weeping with those who are weeping. And finally, when Jesus prayed, "Not my will, but your will be done," and Jesus obeyed the Father even to the point of death. So we too must deny ourselves and really take up the cross and follow Jesus Jesus daily. That's how we unite Jesus in both in suffering and also in the power of resurrection. And when we really unite with Christ, he will give us the glorious crown and give us resurrection and share his resurrection power with us. But my brothers and sisters, let's not forget that this journey is ongoing for the rest of our lives. Even Paul admitted in the passage that he said, "Not that I have already obtained all this or have already arrived at my goal, but I press on. I press on." If Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, and he planted so many different churches and throughout the Roman Empire, if he has still a lot more room to grow, how much more should we? For him, surpassing worth of knowing Christ was never just a one-time event that happened in his life, but it was ongoing, every day, in every moment. And he kept pressing on because uniting with Christ has become the primary purpose of his life. Just like Christina's goal wasn't just simply waiting for me to finish my PhD, but really uniting with me in every aspect so that we can grow together in our relationships. So, in the same way, the goal of our Christian lives should never be about achieving something for Christ or achieving something for myself, but uniting with him. That should be the goal of our lives. And some of you might wonder, "Pastor, how can I unite with him? Because I have a lot of sinful, shameful past. I've sinned a lot, and I have really shameful past. I made really bad decisions in life in the past." And you might say, I'm afraid and I feel too guilty to even begin the relationship with holy and just God who knows everything that I've ever did in the past. How can I even begin to unite with him? How? And here's the answer. That's exactly the kind of people that Jesus is looking for. The people who recognize that you have a shameful past, sinful past, are willing to acknowledge that and come to God. And Jesus is looking for the lost sheep and the sick people who recognize themselves as sick. Because his love and his forgiveness are much bigger than your past. And in verse 13, Paul says that's why he can forget what is in the past, and that's why he is trained toward what is ahead. Because Christ's love and forgiveness really changed his past, and now Paul really can focus on what is in the future. So my brothers and sisters, if you accept Christ, your past sins are forgiven and you are saved. And with the joy of salvation, you can unite with him and walk it with him in his suffering and in his glory. And if the union with Christ, if you're getting to know him deeply, if the union with Christ becomes the goal of your life, and if you continue to faithfully walk with him, and at the end of your life, he will share his glory, his resurrection, his righteousness, and the crown of glory to you. Just as I will be sharing my glory with Christina. So my brothers and sisters, how do we have the surpassing worth of knowing Christ? How do we have that? How do we have the surpassing worth of Jesus Christ in us? It is through union with Christ, in participating in his suffering and also in his glory. Amen? Let's pray.